The morning of November 19th, 1944, northeast France, near the German border, Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann pressed his ear closer to the cold steel of his Panther's hull, listening to the darkness beyond their defensive position. The sound came again through the pre-dawn fog, a rhythmic squeaking and clanking that every German tanker had learned to recognize over the past months. American Shermans, moving up the road. The distinctive metallic chorus of their suspension systems announced them long before they came into view. Hartmann allowed himself a thin smile. Those squeaking bogies, those worn track blocks grinding against road wheels, those loose return rollers chattering with every bump. The Americans might as well have been ringing bells. In the absolute silence of a November night, a Sherman column could be heard from over a kilometer away if conditions were right. The noise was so predictable, so constant, that German forward observers had learned to estimate American tank strength simply by counting the different pitches and rhythms in the mechanical symphony. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. It seemed like a fatal flaw, a weakness born of American industrial haste and their obsession with mass production over quality. The Panther beneath Hartmann's hands made no such sounds. Its interleaved road wheels, its precision German engineering, its superior suspension, all of it whispered rather than shouted. A Panther could approach an enemy position in relative silence. The Americans could not. But that morning, as Hartmann listened to another American column approaching, he noticed something that made his confidence waver. This was the third column he'd heard in 6 hours. The first had passed north at midnight. The second had rumbled east at 0300. Now, as dawn approached, another was moving west. The Americans were everywhere, constantly moving, always somewhere, their tanks grinding and squeaking through the French countryside without pause. Hartmann's Panther, by contrast, hadn't moved in 36 hours. Couldn't move. The final drive had developed the familiar high-pitched whine 2 days ago. The same mechanical failure that seemed to plague half the Panthers in the battalion. Parts had been requisitioned. A recovery vehicle was supposedly en route. Until then, Hartmann's crew would sit in their disabled tank, listening to American armor moving freely around them. By November 1944, the German military found itself facing a crisis that had nothing to do with tactics or courage. It was a crisis of endurance, of logistics, of the grinding, relentless mathematics that governed mechanized warfare. The Americans had solved problems that German engineers barely recognized as problems. Take the suspension. German tank designers had always prioritized silence and smoothness. The interleaved road wheel system on the Panther and Tiger distributed weight beautifully. It gave a comfortable ride. It allowed precise gun laying even while moving, but it came at a cost. Each road wheel on a Panther overlapped with its neighbors. Remove one damaged wheel, and you had to remove half the suspension assembly. In winter, mud and snow froze between the wheels overnight, locking the entire system solid until morning. Maintenance that should take hours required days. The American vertical volute spring suspension system on the Sherman was, by comparison, crude. Simple. Loud. Each bogie assembly consisted of a pair of road wheels mounted on arms connected to a volute spring, a cone-shaped compression spring that squeezed and expanded as the tank rolled over terrain. The springs were mounted vertically inside box-shaped housings on the hull sides. As the tank moved, the road wheel arms compressed these springs, and the springs made noise, metal on metal, the characteristic squeak and groan that announced every Sherman within earshot. German intelligence had documented this weakness extensively. Forward observers reported it. Captured American maintenance manuals confirmed it. The VVSS system was noisy because it was simple. It used basic mechanical principles rather than sophisticated engineering. It was the kind of suspension you'd design if you needed to build 50,000 tanks as quickly as possible and didn't care about elegance. But those same captured manuals revealed something else. Something German analysts initially dismissed as irrelevant. A Sherman crewman could remove and replace an entire bogie assembly in under 4 hours using basic tools. no special equipment required. No need to disassemble half the vehicle, just unbolt the damaged unit, bolt on a replacement, adjust track tension, and drive away. By 1944, this distinction meant everything. Hartmann had joined the Panzerwaffe in 1942, trained at Grafenwöhr, and believed in the absolute superiority of German armoured engineering. The Panther was faster than a Sherman, better armoured. Its 75mm L-70 gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armour at ranges exceeding 2,000 metres. A Sherman's 75mm gun couldn't penetrate a Panther's front even at point-blank range. The mathematics seemed straightforward. In any one-on-one engagement, the Panther won. Therefore, Germany would win. The logic felt sound. The reality proved otherwise. November 19th became November 20th. Hartmann's Panther still sat motionless. The replacement final drive arrived, but the installation required removing the engine. That required a crane. The crane was supporting recovery operations 30 kilometers north. Maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after. American tanks kept moving. The squeaking never stopped. Day and night. Hartmann would doze in his commander's seat, wake to the sound of another Sherman column, check his watch, and realize only 2 hours had passed. They moved constantly. How did they not break down? How did they maintain this tempo? The answer involved systems that German tankers barely understood. The Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was part of an integrated logistics network that the Americans had built with the same mass production philosophy they applied to everything else. Every American armored division rolled with dedicated maintenance battalions, mobile repair shops mounted on trucks, stockpiles of spare parts organized down to individual nuts and bolts, tank recovery vehicles based on the Sherman chassis itself, meaning they could keep pace with advancing armor and retrieve damaged tanks under fire. The Americans had calculated that maintaining mechanical readiness mattered more than perfect engineering. Better to have 100 tanks with 80 operational than 50 tanks with 40 operational. The Sherman's auxiliary power unit exemplified this philosophy. A small gasoline engine, separate from the main power plant, could keep the tank's electrical systems running without starting the main engine. This meant a Sherman could sit in a defensive position with its radios active, its turret power operational, its batteries charging, all while burning minimal fuel and making no engine noise. Crew members could heat rations, check equipment, communicate with other units, all without the giveaway rumble of a 450 horsepower Ford GAA engine. The Panther had no such system. If you wanted electrical power, you started the 700 horsepower Maybach HL 230 engine. That engine consumed fuel at an astonishing rate. It made enough noise to be heard for kilometers. And in late 1944, fuel was something the Wehrmacht could not afford to waste. Germany's fuel situation had been deteriorating for months. The loss of Romanian oil fields in August had cut Germany's primary petroleum source. Allied bombing had devastated synthetic fuel plants across the Reich. By November, fuel allocations to frontline units had been slashed repeatedly. Tanks sat idle, not because they were damaged, but because there was no gasoline to run them. A Sherman's Ford GAA engine produced 450 horsepower and consumed approximately 2.0 litres of gasoline per kilometre on roads, more cross-country. The Panther's Maybach HL 230 produced 700 horsepower but consumed 2.8 litres per kilometre, 40% more than a Sherman. The Tiger consumed even more. In an army with unlimited fuel, this mattered little. In an army rationing every litre, it meant German tanks sat while American tanks moved. The squeaking that had once seemed like an American weakness now took on a different character. Those sounds weren't the noise of poor engineering, they were the sound of tanks that were actually moving. That could afford to move. Fuel, the spare parts, and the logistical support to operate day and night without pause. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Hartmann began to understand this during his third day of immobility. An American infantry patrol had established an observation post in a tree line about 800 meters from his position. They'd spotted his disabled Panther. They were calling in artillery. Hartmann could hear them on the radio, their voices in English but the intent unmistakable. The numbers they were transmitting were coordinates. His tank couldn't move, couldn't retreat. The crew could abandon the vehicle, but that meant losing the Panther. His company commander's orders were explicit: hold the position, defend the tank, wait for recovery. Headquarters needed every operational Panther for the planned counter-offensive. One did not simply walk away from a 48-ton investment. The American artillery arrived 12 minutes later. Not the ranging shot that doctrine called for. No single shell to adjust fire. Something different. 24 shells arriving within a 3-second window. The field to the left of Hartmann's position simply erupted. The blast wave rocked the Panther sideways. Earth and shrapnel hammered the hull. The overpressure was so intense that Hartmann's ears bled. Then silence. Then, through the ringing in his ears, that familiar sound. Squeaking, clanking. A Sherman column rolling past the American observation post, moving toward the front line. The artillery had been covering fire. The Americans weren't trying to destroy his tank. They were simply clearing the area so their armor could advance unopposed. By November 21st, Hartmann's Panther finally received its replacement final drive. The installation took 18 hours. When they test-fired the engine, it ran rough. One of the fuel pumps was leaking. A new pump was requisitioned. The logistics officer estimated 3 to 4 days for delivery. Meanwhile, the Americans had advanced another 12 kilometers. Their supply lines stretched back to Cherbourg, where mountains of equipment arrived daily from across the Atlantic. Spare engines, replacement tracks, entire bogie assemblies, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, rations, everything an army needed to maintain continuous operations. The German supply situation was collapsing. Trains couldn't run because Allied aircraft controlled the skies. Trucks couldn't deliver parts because fuel was being hoarded for the tanks themselves. Repair facilities couldn't function because skilled technicians had been conscripted to fill out depleted infantry units. The entire system was breaking down under pressures it was never designed to handle, and through it all, that squeaking continued. Day and night, the sound of an army that never slept, that never stopped. That had solved the fundamental problem of mechanized warfare in a way German doctrine had never contemplated. This was the great unspoken truth of late-war armoured combat on the Western Front. The tactical victories didn't matter. The superior German tank designs didn't matter. What mattered was which army could keep its tanks running, fueled, and operational around the clock. What mattered was which army had built a logistics system robust enough to support continuous mechanized warfare. The Americans had answered these questions with the same approach they brought to everything else: mass production, standardization, and an unwavering focus on maintainability over perfection. The Sherman wasn't the best tank gun-to-gun, but it was the best tank for total war. It could be repaired quickly. It could operate on minimal maintenance. It could run day and night because it had the logistical support to do so. German tankers had initially welcomed the sound of squeaking Shermans. It told them where the enemy was. It made ambushes easier to plan. It seemed like a gift. But by late 1944, that squeaking had become something else entirely. It was the sound of an army that never stopped moving. That fought through the night while German tanks sat silent for lack of fuel. That replaced combat losses faster than they could be inflicted. That had turned warfare into an industrial process, where victory went not to the most sophisticated designs, but to whoever could field the most operational vehicles for the longest time. Hartmann's Panther finally received its replacement fuel pump on November 26th. By then, American forces had advanced beyond his unit's position. They'd been bypassed, cut off, their defensive line rendered irrelevant by American armor that simply drove around them through countryside. The Germans no longer had the fuel or mobility to defend. The orders came that night: abandon the position, fall back to the German border, try to reach friendly lines. Every tank that could move was to do so immediately. Those that couldn't were to be destroyed, deny them to the enemy. Hartmann started his Panther's engine. The Maybach rumbled to life. The sound was powerful, intimidating, everything a German tank engine should be. But as they rolled out of their defensive position, heading east through the darkness, Hartmann heard something else. Squeaking, clanking. Mechanical noise echoing through the French countryside. American tanks moving somewhere out there in the night. Still moving, always moving, never stopping. His Panther managed 30 kilometers before the final drive failed again. This time there would be no replacement parts, no recovery vehicle. The repair infrastructure no longer existed. Hartmann and his crew set demolition charges, walked away from their tank, and began the long trudge toward Germany on foot. Behind them, the squeaking continued. The Wehrmacht's logistical collapse in late 1944 wasn't sudden. It was a slow hemorrhage that began long before the first Allied soldier stepped onto French soil. But it became undeniable in the grinding attritional warfare that followed the Normandy breakout. The Americans weren't just fighting better, they were fighting longer, continuously, without pause. To understand why German tankers came to fear the squeaking of Sherman suspension, you have to understand what that sound represented in practical terms. It wasn't just the noise of movement. It was proof of a functioning supply chain, proof of available fuel, proof of spare parts, proof of a military-industrial complex that could support continuous operations across an ocean. Every American armored division in Europe operated with approximately 270 Shermans and associated armored vehicles. But those 270 tanks were backed by thousands of support personnel and hundreds of specialized vehicles, tank transporters to move damaged vehicles, wrecker crews with mobile cranes, maintenance companies with complete machine shops mounted on trucks, supply battalions with warehouses of spare parts organized to American panzers, industrial standards, medical units to treat wounded tankers and return them to duty. The Germans had similar support structures, at least on paper. In practice, they'd been systematically destroyed by Allied air power and the collapse of German transportation networks. By November 1944, getting a replacement engine from Germany to France might take weeks, if it arrived at all. The same part could reach an American unit from the United States in 10 days. This disparity manifested in the one metric that mattered most: operational readiness rates. How many of your tanks can actually fight at any given moment? American armored divisions in France maintained operational readiness rates above 90% throughout late 1944. If a division had 200 tanks on paper, at least 180 could move and fight at any time. The other 20 were down for maintenance, but American repair doctrine emphasized speed. Get the tank running again. Do the minimum necessary. Send it back to the front. Worry about perfect repairs later. German panzer divisions were lucky to maintain 50% operational readiness. Often, it was lower. A battalion with 45 Panthers might field 20 operational vehicles, with the other 25 awaiting parts, fuel, or repair facilities that no longer existed. And German doctrine emphasized thorough repairs. Fix it right. Restore it to factory standards. This took time. Time the Wehrmacht no longer had. The sound of squeaking Shermans moving at night became a source of genuine psychological stress for German tankers by December 1944. It meant the Americans were still operational while German tanks sat dark and cold. It meant American crews were getting sleep in shifts while their vehicles remained ready for combat. It meant the enemy had solved problems German engineering had never even seriously addressed. Consider the simple matter of crew rest. A Panther required constant mechanical attention. The engine needed to be warmed regularly in cold weather. Fuel filters had to be drained because moisture would freeze and block fuel lines. The interleaved road wheels needed to be inspected for ice buildup. Track tension had to be checked constantly because the tracks would stretch and contract with temperature changes. All of this required the crew to be awake, outside the tank, working in freezing conditions. A Sherman crew could button up for the night with their auxiliary power unit running, stay warm inside the tank, keep their radio powered, and still be ready to start the main engine and move within 90 seconds if needed. German tankers couldn't do this. They either ran the main engine, wasting precious fuel and advertising their position, or they went cold and dark, which meant vulnerability. The cumulative effect of these small differences was exhaustion. German tank crews by late 1944 were not just outgunned, they were exhausted, chronically sleep-deprived, stressed by the constant mechanical demands of their vehicles, demoralized by watching American armor move freely while they sat immobilized. Panzer Oberfeldwebel Hans Berger kept a diary during November and December 1944. He commanded a Tiger in Schwer Panzerabteilung 501, one of Germany's elite heavy tank battalions. His entries from this period survive, and they make for difficult reading. November 11th. Engine temperature regulation valve failed. Cannot start without overheating risk. Waiting for parts. Americans passed our position during the night. Count 27 Shermans by sound alone. We sit like a bunker. November 16th. Replacement valve arrived but wrong specification. Mechanic attempting field modification. Transmission now making unusual noise. How did it come to this? November 23rd. Fuel allocation cut again. 60 litres for the week. Cannot move more than 15 kilometers even. If everything worked. Americans everywhere. Their tanks sound like factories on tracks, but they move. God in heaven, how they move. December 3rd. Crew morale, very poor. Understand now that we will not win. Not because we lack courage, because we lack fuel. Because our tanks break faster than they can be fixed. Because the Americans can keep fighting all day and all night, and we cannot. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 represented Germany's last major offensive in the West. It was planned as a lightning strike, a return to the blitzkrieg tactics of 1940. Massed armor would punch through American lines, drive to Antwerp, cut off Allied supply lines, and force a negotiated peace. The operation depended on captured American fuel supplies. German planners knew their units had barely enough gasoline to reach their objectives. They counted on overrunning American fuel depots and using that fuel to continue the offensive. This was desperation, masquerading as strategy. The offensive began December 16th. German armor achieved complete surprise and initial success. But within 48 hours, the logistical reality became apparent. German tanks were running out of fuel, not from combat consumption, from simple road marching. The distances were too great, the fuel allocations too small. Meanwhile, American armor rushed to contain the breakthrough. Entire divisions reoriented and moved 100 miles in 24 hours. They could do this because they had fuel, because their tanks were mechanically reliable enough to handle rapid redeployment, because their logistics network could support this kind of flexibility. The squeaking of Sherman suspensions became the soundtrack of the American response to the Bulge. Units moving at night, columns racing to block German spearheads, tanks driving through blizzards because they had the fuel to do so, and the mechanical reliability to arrive ready for combat. By December 26th, when Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Bastogne, the German offensive was already collapsing, not from lack of fighting spirit, from lack of fuel, from mechanical breakdowns, from the simple inability to sustain mechanized operations at the tempo modern warfare demanded. American tank crews at Bastogne reported something remarkable. German attacks often came at dawn and dusk. The Germans would hit hard, then withdraw. American commanders initially interpreted this as tactical caution. Only later did they understand. The Germans were fighting on a schedule dictated by fuel consumption. They could afford one attack per day, maybe two if they were lucky. Then they had to withdraw to conserve fuel. American armor didn't face this constraint. If a position needed to be taken, they attacked. If they were counterattacked, they responded. They didn't have to budget fuel for individual engagements. The Shermans' relatively modest fuel consumption, combined with unlimited logistics, meant American tankers could fight as much as the tactical situation demanded. This is what the squeaking meant. It wasn't just noise. It was the sound of an army that could afford to move whenever it needed to. That wasn't paralyzed by fuel shortages. That had maintenance systems capable of keeping vehicles operational through continuous combat. That had solved the logistical challenges of mechanized warfare so thoroughly that German tankers couldn't even comprehend how it was possible. The stereotype of American armor as inferior to German armor was true in the narrow sense of individual vehicle performance. A Tiger could kill a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman couldn't even effectively respond. But this comparison ignored everything that mattered. Warfare isn't a duel, it's a system, and the Americans had built a better system. That system started with the Sherman itself. The design prioritized things German engineers barely considered. How quickly could an NIFEM engine be replaced? 4 hours for a Sherman, compared to 12 to 16 for a Panther. How long did track replacement take? A trained Sherman crew could replace a thrown track in under an hour. German tanks, with their overlapping road wheels, needed half a day minimum. How much training did maintenance require? American tankers learned basic repairs as part of standard training. German maintenance was specialized work requiring trained technicians. When those technicians became casualties or were reassigned, German maintenance capability collapsed. American maintenance capability didn't because every tank crew could perform emergency repairs. The American system extended beyond the tank to the entire supply chain. Liberty ships bringing supplies from America. Port facilities in Cherbourg and Antwerp handling thousands of tons daily. Rail networks repaired and expanded to support advancing armies. Truck convoys running around the clock. Fuel depots positioned just behind the front lines. Parts depots, organized by standardized catalogue numbers, where any supply clerk could find what was needed. The Germans had some of this, but not at scale, not with redundancy. When Allied bombers destroyed a German supply depot, it might be weeks before a new one was established. When Americans lost a depot, they built 3 more, overwhelming force applied to logistics. The same philosophy that governed tank production governed everything else. By January 1945, the sound of squeaking Shermans triggered a Pavlovian response in German tankers. It meant they were about to be attacked by an enemy that would have artillery support, air support, unlimited ammunition, and no fuel constraints. It meant fighting opponents who'd been rotated off the line, gotten hot meals and maintenance, and returned fresh. It meant facing an army that treated warfare as an industrial process to be optimized, rather than a test of will to be endured. The final collapse of German armor came in the Rhineland campaign of February and March 1945. American forces pushed to the Rhine River, destroying German units that couldn't retreat because they lacked fuel to move. Panther and Tiger tanks, theoretically superior vehicles, were abandoned roadside when they ran out of gas. Some were captured intact, engines cold, crews gone. The Americans evaluated them, confirmed they were mechanically sound, and destroyed them because towing them required more effort than they were worth. The Sherman kept rolling, into Germany itself, across the Rhine, into the heart of the Reich. The squeaking never stopped. Those crude, noisy, allegedly inferior American tanks just kept moving. Day after day, week after week, month after month, never running out of fuel, never unable to get spare parts, never abandoned because recovery vehicles couldn't reach them. German tanker Friedrich Hartmann survived the war. He was captured by American forces in April 1945, while walking toward Bavaria. In a post-war interview conducted in 1947, he was asked what he remembered most about fighting the Americans. "The noise," he said. "Those Sherman tanks made so much noise. We could hear them coming from kilometers away. At first, we thought it was a weakness, something to exploit, but after months of fighting, I understood. That noise was the sound of tanks that were actually moving, that had fuel, that had parts, that could fight all day and all night. Our Panthers were silent, beautiful, perfectly engineered, and useless. We had no fuel to run them, no parts to fix them. The Americans won because they solved the simple problems. How do you keep a tank running? How do you feed an army? How do you maintain continuous operations? They answered these questions better than we did, much better. The Sherman tank was designed by a committee of American engineers who'd never built a tank before 1941. They learned from British experience in the desert. They studied German tactics in France. They looked at what had worked and what had failed, and they created something that was, in purely technical terms, mediocre. The armor was adequate but not exceptional. The gun was useful but not outstanding. The suspension was simple but noisy. The engine was reliable but not powerful. Nothing about the Sherman was cutting edge. It was a compromise vehicle, good enough in every category, exceptional in none, except the categories that mattered for total war. It could be mass-produced. It could be maintained in the field with basic tools. It could operate for extended periods without extensive servicing. It could be repaired quickly. It used standardized parts. It was reliable. It was available in overwhelming numbers. These unsexy characteristics won the war in the West. Not tactical brilliance, not superior courage, not better engineering, logistics, reliability, industrial capacity. The ability to keep tanks moving, fueled, armed, and operational regardless of conditions. The Americans built a system that supported continuous mechanized warfare. The Germans did not. The squeaking of Sherman suspensions was the audible proof of this fundamental difference. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, American armored divisions had tanks that had been in combat for 8 or 9 months straight, vehicles with tens of thousands of kilometers on their engines, suspensions that squeaked loud enough to wake the dead, track blocks worn smooth, paint long gone, replaced by rust and mud and battle damage hastily patched, and they still ran, still moved, still fought, because they'd been designed to do exactly that, to be good enough for long enough to overwhelm an enemy through sheer persistence. The German tanks that survived were museum pieces, technical marvels abandoned roadside for lack of fuel, Panthers with pristine interiors and frozen engines, Tigers captured intact because their crews had walked away when the fuel ran out. The most sophisticated armoured vehicles in the world, reduced to paperweights by logistical collapse. The lesson was clear. In modern mechanized warfare, superiority isn't measured by individual vehicle performance. It's measured by how many operational vehicles you can field, for how long, under what conditions. The Americans understood this. The Germans learned it too late. The squeaking of Sherman bogies wasn't a weakness. It was a philosophy made audible, a rejection of perfection in favor of reliability, an acceptance that the best tank isn't the one with the thickest armor or the biggest gun. It's the one that's actually moving when you need it. That has fuel in the tank. That can be fixed when it breaks. That keeps fighting long after more sophisticated machines have been abandoned by the roadside. German tankers heard those squeaks and initially rejoiced. An enemy that announced its presence. How foolish. How American. How typical of their crude engineering. But by the end, they understood. Those sounds weren't announcing weakness. They were announcing victory. The victory of persistence over perfection, of reliability over sophistication, of an army that had solved the fundamental problems of mechanized warfare so completely that it could afford to field tanks that squeaked loud enough to be heard a kilometer away. Because when you have unlimited fuel, unlimited spare parts, unlimited industrial capacity, and a logistics system that never stops working, you don't need your tanks to be silent. You just need them to keep moving, and the Shermans never stopped moving. The squeaking continued right into Berlin, right into the heart of the Reich that had once believed its engineering superiority would guarantee victory. It was the soundtrack of American armor rolling through Germany in the spring of 1945, a mechanical symphony of simple, reliable, mass-produced vehicles that had outlasted, outfought, and out-endured the most sophisticated tanks ever built. Not because they were better machines, because they were part of a better system. And in total war, the system wins. Always. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.